This next section is going to be about the Spanish-American War and continuing on with the idea of moving from isolationism to imperialism as a foreign policy. So we were growing, our interest was growing in the Pacific, in owning pieces of land there. As far as trade goes, the U.S. businesses want to expand resources of cheap raw material to compete economically with Europe. All the people in Europe, most of the people in Europe were involved in imperialism. You go out, you conquer territory, you steal the resources, you use the resources to manufacture goods, and then you actually sell them back to the people that you stole the resources from. Well, if America didn't get involved in the same game, then we were going to be behind economically, because those countries would be able to actually manufacture goods at a much lower price than the United States would. We needed military bases to protect U.S. trade in the region and to act as coal refueling stations for our fleet, which our fleet has to be really big to have a big empire. We also have white man's burden, okay? Christians typically at this time in history came from Europe. And because most Europeans were white, in fact all of them were, this became a big thing. So in the Bible it says that it's your responsibility, if you're a Christian, to go forth and spread the gospel and try to get other people to accept Jesus as their Savior, to save them from hell. Well, when you take that idea and you mix it with imperialism, you get this wonky thing called white man's burden, where we basically have to go out and conquer all these people that are heathens, these people that are not Christians, so we can convert them into Christianity while stealing their raw materials and letting that support us. Okay? So that's what white man's burden is. It's really not that good of a thing. Alright, a U.S. protective tariff on sugar had destroyed Cuba's economy. Okay? So we raised a tariff on Cuban sugar because what we wanted is we wanted Cuba to revolt. And so we told the Cubans, so long as Spain is in control of Cuba, which is what we've talked about before, that America would not trade with them. America's not going to buy their sugar. And at the time, we were the only customer for Cuba. So Cuban farmers, they decided to go on a revolution, to have a revolution to kick out the Spanish. And we backed the Cubans. We gave them, just like Ukraine today, we gave them ammunition, we gave them weapons, and all that stuff. So, around this time, we are using our yellow journalists. Yellow journalists are people that lie in the news to sell papers or to start wars. We used William Randolph Hearst in order to start the Cuban Revolution and to get Americans involved. We wanted a war with Spain so we could take away their imperial possessions so that way we could steal those resources for ourselves. And so William Randolph Hearst printed several lies in the newspaper about what was going on. As soon as the Cubans revolted, Spain came down with a large army and crushed the Cuban rebellion. And what they basically did is, in the newspaper, William Randolph Hearst was saying that the Spanish were raping women in the streets and that they were peeling the skin off of babies with needle nose pliers and stuff like that. All this stuff is false, okay? But when Americans read that in the newspaper, they're like, oh my God, we've got to go and stop the Spanish, right? So, anyway, a lot of Spain was under lockdown, basically, by the Spanish, a lot of Cuba was under lockdown by the Spanish government. And there was a very important businessman in America named E.C. Knight. He's going to be our sugar robber baron. And you've learned about him last chapter. E.C. Knight owned several sugar plantations, and he also contributed heavily to the president's campaign. So he had a visit with the president and told him, you need to go down there and protect my sugar cane from the Spanish. And so we sent one ship, the USS Maine, to Havana Harbor to make sure that the Spanish did not go in or out of the harbor and to protect his sugar cane. Well, the Maine ended up blowing up in the middle of the night. And we thought, very much so, that it was the Spanish that did it. We thought that a Spanish torpedo had sunk the ship. Decades later, we actually dove down to see what was wrong with the main, and we found out that actually the boiler had exploded from the inside out. So unless it was a terrorist attack or some kind of a spy that got on board and blew up the boiler, it's probably just operator error. They probably let the boiler run too low on water and it blew up because of the pressure increased so much. So we're about ready to go to war with Spain, and we basically tell Spain, we're going to go to war with you unless you free Cuba and let Cuba alone, let them have their freedom. And Spain said, okay, we'll give Cuba their freedom. And then our president basically said, no, it's too late. You've already killed Americans, so we're going to war. So Congress declares war on Cuba, and now we're in a small little war that only lasts about 16 weeks, okay? The person that was most excited about this war breaking out was a young Teddy Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, that's second in charge of the Navy. And he ends up he quits that job, and there's a law in the U.S. military, in the Army specifically, that says if you put a regiment of men together, then you can actually command them whether or not you have any military experience or not. So the famous man Teddy Roosevelt puts a new regiment together, a cavalry regiment, which means they ride on horseback, called the Rough Riders, of over 1,000 different people from all walks of life. You have college kids in there, you have Native Americans, you have cowboys, you have exodusters, all these kinds of people, and they're all joining in under Teddy Roosevelt. At the end of the war, we whipped them really bad. It was a very lopsided war, and we captured Guam, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. Now, we had already promised Cuba we were going to give them their freedom with the Teller Resolution. But then we blackmailed them with the Platt Amendment and said that Cuba had to give us a military base called Guantanamo Bay if they were going to get released and be free. Now, the Philippines, they did not want to be part of America's empire. So the Filipino people started fighting us, and for 3 years they fought us until Blackjack Pershing, who is the commander of the American forces, he found out that most of the Filipinos that were fighting were Muslims. And so he did something that was unthinkable by today's standards. Muslims, according to the Quran, if they touch pork or eat pork, they will go to hell if they ingest pork. So it's one of the big sins of being a Muslim. So what we did was we took our bullets, all of our bullets, and we dipped them in pig's blood. And then he went out and killed 500 or 600 of them, and he put them all in a mass grave with pig bullet, or bacon bullet, whatever you want to call it, still in them. And he poured pig's blood on top of the men, and then he put the pigs on top of the men, the dead bodies of the pigs, and buried the Muslims like that. And the Muslims quit fighting right after that happened. So, all right, let's keep on going here. Which statement describes the similarity between the U.S. intervention in Hawaii and the Philippines in the 1890s? Okay. Both actions caused heavy military losses to the Spanish? No, not true. Both actions, natives convert to Christianity? Yeah, maybe. Both actions were welcomed by the majority of the native population? No, not at all. Both actions were motivated by commercial and military interests. Imperialism, folks. That's what it is, folks, right there, okay? Now, eventually, President Roosevelt is going to become president, and there was an old doctrine from the early 1800s called the Monroe Doctrine. James Monroe, one of our early presidents, said that Europeans were causing too much trouble in the new Americas, basically. So he said, from now on, if you have colonies in the Americas, and this is called the Monroe Doctrine, if you have colonies in the Americas, you can keep them. However, there will be no new colonies in the Americas because Europeans keep coming over here and starting wars on our doorstep, and some of those wars we had to get involved in. And we wanted peace We wanted isolationism. So when Roosevelt comes along, Roosevelt says that we're going to have the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Corollary means change or correlation to. Anyway, so the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine says that we're going to use our Navy as the new police of this half of the planet. And if the Europeans have trouble with their colonies, they don't need to come over here to settle it. They need to tell us, and we're going to act as policemen, and we're going to go settle the situation for them. And because of that, our Navy had to grow tremendously. Because of the Spanish-American War, America realized it needed a shortcut from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This led Roosevelt to push through the Panama Canal. So in Panama is a little tiny piece of land that connects North and South America. And we dug, over 10 years, we dug a trench that goes from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. And that was all because of the battleship Oregon and its trip around South America during the Spanish-American War. All right, moving on. We already did that. Okay, we also have a couple more policies here. Dollar diplomacy, that's paying people to be your friend as well. Okay. All right, here we go. How did the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine modify the U.S. approach of imperialism? All right. Let's see. It's going to be this one, okay? America had to expand its military or Navy presence throughout the Americas. That was the next thing. All right, guys, as Teddy Roosevelt goes on with his presidency, he ends up making a deal in China. We were about to tear China, China. We're about to tear China apart and split it between all the European powers. But the open door policy, which saves China from that fate, said that every European power, including America, could trade with China, and they could all have military bases in China so long as they paid for those military bases. And that stopped China from being carved up like Africa was in the late 1800s.